Shalom everyone, welcome to a new video on our channel, Jóvenes Peregrinando, and we are going to continue our series study of the Torah. As you may know, or for those of you who watched last week's video, we have started to study a new book in the Bible known as Leviticus, or in its Hebrew name, Vayikra. Today's title for this video is called A Voluntary Offering, and we will be continuing to study what we had already started to study last week, which was the offerings that the Eternal instructed from the people of Israel. In the beginning of each book, we analyzed that although in English we come to know them under their given name that has been translated over time from the Latin language, their actual names for each of these books derive from the first word that is found in Hebrew at the beginning of each book. In this case, we have Vayikra, and its root comes from kara, from Hebrew 7121 in Strong's lexicon, and it means to call out. The name of Leviticus itself was given solely because many of these instructions are given or directed primarily to the Levites, who were the ones to be ministering the sanctuary that had been edified by the people of Israel. Yet, as we study further on, we will see that despite many of these instructions being told to the Levites, in reality, they were important for all of the Israelites. So it wasn't just a book or a set of instructions given only to the tribe of Levi. This brings us into analyzing the importance of the Hebrew name of this book. Because as we have been seeing, a lot of the names that we see in these books actually have a very important message or meaning behind them. And in this case, there is a difference between calling out to someone and simply talking to or saying something to them. We can think in this case that the Eternal called to Moshe to bring something to his attention. At least this is how I came to understand it. As we already analyzed, the sanctuary in which the divine presence was to dwell in would lie in the outskirts of the camping site where the Israelites were staying, as his presence was holy and could not dwell amongst the Israelites who were in a state of impurity. This was a consequence for this transgression with the idolatry to the golden calf. Now, originally we understood that the purpose or what the Eternal wanted to do was for his divine presence to dwell amongst the Israelites. We saw that in Exodus chapter 25, verse 8. But due to that transgression in which they had fallen into, we see that as a consequence, that divine presence could dwell amongst them. And as that divine presence descended to dwell in the sanctuary, it was probable that the Israelites, including Moshe, were in awe and astonishment as they regarded the event that was unfolding before their eyes. As they saw the divine presence, they could have been shocked and staring at what was happening before them. And here, this is what brings us to the word Vayikra. The Eternal called Moshe to bring to his attention the fact that although the divine presence was descending, it was not going to dwell amongst the Israelites as they were impure. Therefore, he was going to give them instructions on what they needed to do in order to be able to come near the Father's presence. This is how we begin to see the first offering mentioned in Leviticus, which was the burnt offering of Olah, which is what we studied last week. And this was an offering that was given in perfection. It was a complete offering that was burnt and that represented how the Israelites were not only looking to have reconciliation with the Father, but they also wanted to offer their own life in complete consecration to the Almighty. Although the offerings that we will continue to see in the next couple of chapters, including the Olah, are not applied to us physically today in our life, we can still learn and apply them to our spiritual life, especially since we, like the Israelites, are found in a state of impurity when we live a life separated from the Eternal, getting contaminated with the golden calves of the world, which are plenty, as we have seen previously. Yet, through our Messiah's perfect delivery, we are purified by his blood, and through the Father's Torah, we are also washed, as it penetrates into our innermost being and it takes out all of the traces of impurity that may lie within. And with this new purification, we are able to come close to the Father. But we must be careful to do it in the correct way as it pleases Him. And this is why it is important to learn from each of these offerings or korbanot. Now, the korban that we will see today can be found in the second chapter of Vayikra. From verses 1 to 3 it says, "When anyone brings a grain offering to the Eternal, their offering is to be of the finest flour. They are to pour olive oil on it, put incense on it, and take it to Aaron's sons, the ministers. The minister shall take a handful of the flour and oil, together with all the incense, and burn this as a memorial portion on the altar, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Almighty. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the food offerings presented to Elohim." The word that we can find in Hebrew for grain offering is mincha. In Strong's Lexicon or Strong's Dictionary, we can find it as Hebrew 4503. And it means, or it's from an unused root meaning to apportion, that is, bestow, a donation, euphemistically tribute, specifically a sacrifice or sacrificial offering, usually bloodless and voluntary. And this offering of mincha can also be referred to or known as an oblation. This offering was, as it says in the text, a grain offering, meaning there was no animal sacrifice. Not only was the grain to be offered, but it had to be of the finest flour, with olive oil poured on it and incense. From many of the korbanot, not all, a portion was separated or kept for Aaron and his sons, and this was the nourishment that they would receive from the Eternal through the Israelites. Taking into consideration that by being ministers, they were consecrated to the service at the temple and had no inheritance like the rest of the tribes did, as their inheritance was the Eternal. The mincha offering was voluntary, something that came from the people of Israel and was not mandatory. We can think of it as an offering that was given to the Father in gratitude for all He had done for them ever since He had taken them out of Egypt, and for the benevolence as well and mercy that He showed for not destroying them despite their rebellious attitude. We also, as believers, have many reasons to be thankful to our Almighty for everything He has done for us, from the moment He showed us His truth through Yeshua up until today at this very moment. It may have crossed our minds, and this is a question that we could have possibly asked ourselves at the beginning of our service, or at the beginning that when we started to learn and understand His Torah, how can we thank Him for all He has done and continues to do? And this is a question that many of us could probably ask ourselves. And for this, the scripture teaches us how we can do so through the elements that are mentioned here in the second chapter of Leviticus. The first element that we find in order to make this mincha offering is the finest flour. The text doesn't specify as to this flour had to be made from wheat or barley, but what we can see here is that it had to be of the finest flour produced from the grain that was to be offered. And it is a representation of all the work that the Israelites had to do in order to offer the best of the best, from preparing and plowing the field to sowing the seeds, watering and caring for them, and all the way to harvesting them once ready. Afterwards, they had to pick the grains and gather the amount they wanted to offer to the Eternal. From there, they were to grind the grains in order to get the finest flour possible, and sift it as well in order to make sure that it was fine. This offering was the result from the cultivation and preparation of their offering for mincha. When we reflect on how this offering can be applied to our life, we can think about Yeshua's teachings. In the parables of the sower and of the weeds, He explains to His disciples that He is the sower who came and sowed the seed, which is the word, in the land, which represents us. Not only those who receive the word, or only those who receive the word with joy and understanding are able to produce fruits and become a part of the kingdom established by Him. We can see this in Matthew chapter 13, verse 23, as well as in verses 41 to 43. And the Eternal begins his work in us through Yeshua, who came to this world in order to sow his message of good news in our field. Once we receive that word, his Torah comes into our life as the water that nourishes us. And our Messiah's testimony is the light that helps guide us forward in our pilgrimage. Yet, despite seeing the Father do all this work in us, it is important to note that it is not just them who have to work in our lives in order to reach the heavenly abodes, as we must also put effort into maintaining the seed while nourished and receiving light. We must voluntarily surrender ourselves to the Father so that his holy breath can guide us during this time that we nurture and care for this seed. Because we can't just think, and some people have thought this, and I have thought this myself, we can't just think that the Eternal Father can help us and guide us in his instruction and that we don't have to do anything about it. We must understand that in order for us to grow spiritually within the kingdom that the Eternal established through Yeshua, in order for us to learn about his instruction, it is necessary for us to also put the effort into it, for us to also persevere in his instruction so that we can actually learn. If we don't put effort into it, and if we just continue to live a life how we wanted to, thinking that the Eternal as well as Yeshua are working in our life, that they're there for us, then we're going to fall into that pattern that we see most of the world, and that into thinking and that mindset that we can continue to live our life how we want to and that there won't be any consequences. But we understand that although the Eternal and the Messiah work on us and they mold us like a jar, we must also understand that we also have to put in our part, put in our effort. And that is why we see this aspect of that voluntary work. And we see how we go through this process with the Eternal and how this continues or begins to reflect in our life, and how we must also nurture and care for the seed that we have received so that it can grow. And by doing so, we will begin to see in our life the production of fruits. And when we talk about fruits, it's not a literal fruit like an apple or an orange, but it's those fruits of prayer, of exaltation, of service and obedience, as well as justice based on what the Eternal teaches us. And each one of these fruits that we produce must be consecrated to our Father. And this is our mincha offering, when we voluntarily offer the best of what we can give to our Eternal, and that is the product of our perseveration and obedience to him. But let's keep in mind as well that we can't just offer him anything that we want, as many people who call themselves believers oftentimes offer what they think is right and what pleases them, and not so much what the Eternal is actually looking for. We must not fall into the same mindset or ideology. And the next elements will actually teach us important key points that will help us voluntarily offer an offering that pleases our Elohim. The second element that we can find and can help us understand this a bit more is the olive oil. Now, the olive oil, or the oil in general, is an element that we have seen in the past, which represents the anointment we receive through the Ruach HaKodesh, or the holy breath or divine presence of our Creator. Now, everything we offer must be anointed by his holy breath, as it is the one that guides us to offer our fruits in truth, with understanding and knowledge of our Father's will, and not in a blinded way. Our Messiah said in John chapter 16, verse 13, that when the Spirit of truth were to come, he was going to guide us into all the truth, and that he was not going to speak in his own will, but he was only going to speak what he hears, and he was going to tell what was to come. So we see that he tells this to his emissaries, who were the ones to receive the anointment first, with the 120 who were anointed on that festivity of Shavuot. But we also see that this Ruach continued to establish itself, not just in the Israelites, but also within the nations. So this is how we see that this anointing of the Ruach also applies to us. Therefore, every fruit offering, which is the product of our service to him, must be made with the anointing of the Ruach, with the understanding of our Father's truth, which is his instruction, and what he is seeking from us. We must not offer something that is influenced by the world just because we like it and because we think it's correct. And it shouldn't be something that feels like a sacrifice to us, because many people have come to think that when it comes to giving a sacrifice to the eternal, or offering ourselves as a living sacrifice, as Shaul of Tarsus taught, many people think that living our life in consecration or serving the Father is something that burdens us, something that feels like a sacrifice and that can be heavy for us. But in reality, we must understand that it is not something that is going to be a burden, and it is not something that feels heavy for us to give, or that we feel like we have to give it up forcefully. On the contrary, an offering is something that comes from our innermost being, something that comes voluntarily, and that we want to do so because of everything that we have experienced with the Eternal, and because we owe it to Him. We owe it to Him for everything that He has done in our life. And we must remember that everything we offer to our Almighty is consecrated to Him. It should no longer be used or mixed with the world, but only for His exaltation. That is a part of a consecration. The next element that we can find here is incense. And this represents the prayers of the righteous, as we can see in Revelations chapter 5, verse 8, meaning that it represents the communication that we have with our Creator. Because a prayer isn't just a simple prayer, as different religious institutions have taught it, but it is a communication that we have with the Eternal in private. It's something that we have with Him in order to communicate with Him and share with Him everything that we have learned, as well as our doubts, our thoughts, and what we seek from Him. In Revelation chapter 5, verse 8, it says, golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the Kedoshim, meaning the saints, which is those who are separated and consecrated to Elohim. Now, it doesn't just represent the relationship that we have with Him as His children, but it also helps us understand that our voluntary offering must be done with integrity, as the scripture teaches us that the offering of the person in iniquity will not be received by the Almighty. Without this incense, our offering will not be accepted by the Eternal, meaning that without integrity in our service, our offering will not be pleasing to Him. In Proverbs chapter 15, verse 8, it says, "The Eternal detests the sacrifice of the wicked, but the prayer of the upright pleases Him." And in Proverbs 28, chapter 9, it says, "If anyone turns a deaf ear to my instruction, even their prayers are detestable." In short, our mincha is a voluntary offering that we give to the Eternal, and it is the product of our perseveration, as we strive to learn and serve Him in His kingdom, offering Him the finest fruits we can give Him. And these are the ones that grow every day with His instruction. We understand our offering is voluntary. This is a key point or a key factor as to the offering of mincha. It is something voluntary, as He has given us from the beginning the free will to choose who we want to serve. And the product of our service must be guided by the Ruach and in integrity, meaning that we shouldn't have any contamination with the world. We must be pure. And finally, it must be offered through Yeshua, a great minister, and not through the world. We shouldn't bring any strange fire to the Eternal. And this is a concept that we will learn as well later on in the book of Leviticus. From verses 4 to 10, it says, "If you bring a grain offering baked in the oven, it is to consist of the finest flour, either thick loaves made without yeast and with olive oil mixed in, or thin loaves made without yeast and brushed with olive oil. If your grain offering is prepared on a griddle, it is to be made of the finest flour mixed with oil and without yeast. Crumble it and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your grain offering is cooked in a pan, it is to be made of the finest flour and some olive oil. Bring the grain offering made of these things to the Elohim. Present it to the minister, who shall take it to the altar. He shall take out the memorial portion from the grain offering and burn it on the altar as a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Eternal. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is the most holy part of the food offerings presented to Elohim." In these couple of verses, we see three ways in which the Israelites would or could offer their grain offering. The first method or the first option is the option where it could be baked in an oven. And here we see that the instruction was for it to be with the finest flour, with olive oil mixed in it or brushed, and without yeast. The second option was for it to be prepared on a griddle, and this was to be made of the finest flour mixed with olive oil and without yeast. And lastly, the third option was for it to be cooked in a pan, and this had to be made of the finest flour and with some olive oil. These three different options represent the different ways in which the Israelites could offer a mincha to the Eternal. And we could also see that in the different offerings that we give to the Almighty. And some come and say that it is possible that the Eternal gave these options so that all Israelites, regardless of what they owned, would be able to do this offering. These are all different methods provided by the Eternal, but however, there is a key factor that they all had in common, something that was very important, and they had to be made without yeast. Even though the last option does not state anything about it being made without yeast, in the next verses we will see that if a grain was cooked in a pan, it also had to be made without yeast if they wanted it to be an offering pleasing to the Eternal. In verses 11 through 13 it says, "Every grain offering you bring to the Eternal must be made without yeast, for you are not to burn any yeast or honey in a food offering presented to the Eternal. You may bring them to Elohim as an offering of the first fruits, but they are not to be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma. Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your Elohim out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings." Every grain offering must not have two ingredients, which were yeast and honey. Here we understand that although the previous method about it being cooked or prepared on a griddle did not include the instruction without yeast, it was in the knowledge and understanding of the Israelites that all their grain offerings had to be done so without yeast if they wanted it to be offered to the Eternal as something with a pleasing aroma. In verse 12, it says that they could bring it to the Almighty, but it would not be offered on the altar. Both yeast and honey are two elements that also teach us something important about how our voluntary service must be offered. The first element, which was yeast, is, or we come to understand it today, it is a microorganism that is classified scientifically in the fungus kingdom. Ancient Egyptians are credited to being the first ones who used yeast by leaving leftover dough to stand before it was baked. Once that leftover dough was added to a new batch, it would cause the new one to rise. And as we already know, or as we have already seen and learned in the book of Exodus, the Israelites were living in oppression by the Egyptians. But once liberated by Moshe, they were able to live and serve the Eternal freely, and they were able to leave Egypt. Yet, by analyzing the text and taking into consideration how yeast is credited to the Egyptians, we can infer that the Israelites had very likely learned that same practice from them on how to add leavening to their dough. This makes us reflect on how the Eternal may not have wanted yeast in a mincha offering that was to be presented on the altar to have yeast, because he did not want it to be including that aspect of the yeast that was already accredited to the Egyptians and to their practices. And it also represents how their voluntary service to him could not be done so or guided by the things of this world, that it had to be separated from it. Yeast also represents the pride and corruption that can be found in the attitude of mankind. The Messiah teaches us this aspect when he says in Mark 8, chapter 15, "Be careful," he warned them, "watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." When Yeshua taught to watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees, he wanted his disciples to not be contaminated by their doctrines, the laws that they would impose on men, yet they themselves would not fulfill. The Pharisees were called doctors of the law, as people who had studied the Torah and who were supposed to know and teach it to others, However, their life was not actually guided by the Eternal's Torah. Instead, it was guided by their own interpretations and rituals. Not only did they create their own laws, but they also lived in hypocrisy, as Yeshua also taught that these Pharisees would only seek attention, power, and recognition from the Israelites, not so much to guide them into the Eternal's instruction. As for the yeast of Herod, it also included their own doctrines and philosophy, which seemed appalling to many, but was only a path that led them away from the Creator's instructions. This brings us to understand how it's applied to our life, that our offering should not be or should not have or be made with yeast, meaning that it is not guided by the false teachings that the world gives. There are many religious institutions that state or call themselves to be the way of truth, and that they are devoted to the one and only Almighty. Yet when we analyze their life and their teachings, we find nothing but hypocrisy and falsehood, as their teachings do not validate the Torah and they distort Yeshua's teachings. Not only this, but they also receive payments from the people by calling them tithes. But in reality, although the tithe was actually a commandment that we find within the instruction or within the strictures, we understand that this tithe that they ask from the people is actually a lie, and that they make their followers believe that it is necessary in order for them to have eternal life. We shouldn't fall into these traps and lies that only separate us from the Father. Instead, we should be separated from them. A true korban, which is a way to come close to the Eternal, is done with understanding based on His Torah and on Yeshua's testimony. Therefore, it should not be influenced by the world and the way they act or believe. The second element that we find here that shouldn't be included, or that wasn't supposed to be included in the mincha offering, was honey. Now, it is an ingredient that is sweet, and when added to dough, and once it was baked, it also gave it a sweet taste provided. So we can ask ourselves, why would we not add a sweet ingredient? Wouldn't it have a pleasing aroma? Some comments state that honey used to be utilized in ancient rituals of the pagan nations offered to their deities. This could be a reason as to why the Israelites weren't able to offer a burnt offering on the altar. But we must remember that the Eternal would allow the offerings, or would allow grain offerings to be offered with yeast and honey. It just wouldn't be burned in the altar as a memorial. On the other hand, we can understand honey as a sickly sweetness that is offered in the world. We can think of the way in which religious leaders talk, for example. Their teachings are sweet like honey to the ear. When we listen to what they say, it's something that is very pleasing and satisfying to human needs, and that sounds very sweet, harmonious almost. Yet, they are dangerous, as the honey offered by them only hinders us from serving the Father. It may be sweet, it may sound beautiful and harmonious, but in reality, it is very dangerous, and it can keep us from being able to come close to our Creator. With this, we understand that our voluntary offering was not to be made with the pride and corruption that can be found in mankind, nor with the dangerous sweetness with which the world speaks and portrays itself. Instead, we must be pure, anointed by our Father's holy breath and in integrity. In these last verses, or in these verses that we just read, there is also one more ingredient that the Eternal instructed to be included, which was the salt. Within the text, we see that the Eternal repeated the word salt 3 times, emphasizing twice that it had to be added in all of their grain offerings, and explaining once that it should not be left out, as it represents the covenant of Elohim with His people. We understand that salt gives flavor to the food, but it is also perdurable. It can make food last longer, and it is also known to be antiseptic, that it can wash and kill any impurities. Now, the Eternal's covenant with His people is long-lasting. It is imperishable, and once the Messiah returns, the promise we received through His offering will be fulfilled for those who remained in obedience to Elohim. And He also purifies us. He washes and removes any impurities that can be found in our lives, so that we can also become like the salt in this world. And this is something that we see Yeshua say in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. We are the salt of the world, which is what we understand with Yeshua. Just as we have been purified by the Eternal's instruction, we can also be an instrument that helps purify those around us with our testimony. But if we decide to rebel or disobey the Eternal by forgetting his instruction, then we cannot serve him anymore, as he only seeks those who will serve him in spirit and truth, just as the Messiah taught with his conversation with the Samaritan woman. Therefore, any salt that loses its saltiness gets thrown out. This helps us understand why our voluntary offering must always have salt. And really, it helps us understand as well that our life itself is a voluntary offering, because we are voluntarily surrendering ourselves before the Eternal, so that it is him who lives in us, and so that it is his presence who dwells inside our body and inside our spirit, so that we can serve him in the way that he wants us to. And this is why we see that it is important for us to always have this spiritual salt within our life every single day, so that we never forget the promises that we have received in Yeshua, so that we don't forget the renewed covenant that we have made to be a part of, and so we never forget the perfect offering that Yeshua made. This way, we can continue to function in this world as salt that purifies, and so we are not thrown out into the fire upon the Messiah's return. Now, to conclude this chapter, we will read the last couple of verses, which are verses 14 to 16. It says, "If you bring a grain offering of first fruits to the Eternal, offer crushed heads of new grain roasted in the fire. Put oil and incense on it. It is a grain offering. The priest shall burn the memorial portion of the crushed grain and the oil, together with all the incense, as a food offering presented to the Eternal." The Eternal concludes the mincha offering by explaining that the Israelites had to do, or what they had to do, if they were to bring a grain offering of first fruits. We understand that these first fruits are the first product of the harvest, meaning that before anything else is used, this one is brought before the great minister as an offering that is consecrated to the Eternal. This can be understood as a way to show their gratitude for the nourishment the Eternal provides to his people, as he is the one who provided all the nutrients, which were light, water, and soil necessary to grow their crops. And we can see this as well in our life when we are found with this ability to, or this opportunity to offer our spiritual first fruits to the Eternal. Everything we learned and are able to do within our life, within our day-to-day, everything can be offered to him as a way to show our gratitude for giving us the opportunity to live one more day and learn his Torah. And every single day, this offering that we give to the Eternal has to be roasted in the fire, which we understand the fire has to do with purification as well as the judgment that the Eternal gives. So we must always be judging whether this first fruit that we are offering is really best of the best, and if it is really everything that we can give to the Eternal. And we have to make sure that it is purified by his Torah, and to have that oil and incense that is needed in order for us to give him something that is pleasing to him, and not something that is probably pleasing to us, but is impure to him. To summarize, if we want to offer our life in consecration to the Eternal, it must be done so voluntarily, meaning we must not feel it as a burden, nor as something that was forced from us by someone else. With this voluntary offering, we must include all of our service, understanding that we no longer live or work for ourselves, but instead we have been obtained through the price of Yeshua. Therefore, we belong to him. Through our service, everything we do can be offered to him, as it is a product of our obedience and dedication that is consecrated to him. But we must remember that it should always be guided by his Ruach and presented before him in integrity. Our service should not be contaminated with the falsehood, the pride, the hypocrisy, and corruption of the world, nor should it be influenced by the mere sweet words and actions that people can portray. Instead, it should always have present the Father's covenant that he established through Yeshua, so we can always remember to remain pure in order for us to also give a good testimony to those who surround us. With all of these elements applied in our life, then our service, our voluntary offering, will always be pleasing to the Eternal, as we will seek to offer the best of the best and not what is left over. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 to 24 say, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Eternal, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Eternal as a reward. It is the Messiah you are serving." This is all for today's video. With this last verse, we conclude it. Thank you for watching, and if you'd like, you can give us a like and share so that we can all continue growing and learning together as the body of the Messiah. Once again, thank you, and we will see you again in the next video. Shalom.